All right, welcome to Korea. I'm Alex Dobie with Android Central.
And I'm Andrew Martinick.
We've been here in Seoul this past week getting to know the new LG G6. We, of course, have a hands-on report up right now that you can go and check out. But we've also been getting a look at some of the behind-the-scenes stuff, the manufacturing, testing, development, all the other cool stuff that goes into making a new flagship phone. So the G6 itself, of course, is very different. It's an extra tall phone. Kind of interesting to see that from LG.
Yeah, this change of pace from LG going to this 18:9 display, which of course should be just a 2:1 display.
Yeah, if you
doesn't
use
really matter.
Actual math to work that out.
But this move to that taller display and this metal and glass construction with very small bezels has let LG kind of rethink its entire smartphone design strategy. And we'll talk about the software in a little bit, but just the hardware. LG thinks that this is going to be a movement for the entire industry and future phones for itself, going extra tall to keep the phone narrow and easy to use in one hand.
Yeah, so it's all about having that bigger screen. It's a 5.7 incher, which seems like a big screen, but of course you have the extra tallness of it, which means you can fit all of that screen real estate in your hand really easily. And it actually called out Samsung and Apple. You know, we're all expecting an extra tall Galaxy S8, an extra tall iPhone potentially as well. LG is there, it says first. LG, of course, always loves to be first with stuff. And that just means that you know, they have that extra publicity advantage, but of course you know, they're also having the opportunity to build some of that stuff into their software with the 2:1 display and splitting it between different UI proportions.
Yeah, and it really is all about usability, both in the hardware and the software. We talked about the narrower width. They talked about this magic kind of width of 72 millimeters for the phone. And if you go wider than that, you start to alienate the bulk of people that want to use their phone, you know, looking down at it one hand as they're walking around, or, you know, maybe riding a bike or something like that. Who knows, you know, something smaller than the V20, and again, they threw a little shade at Samsung, talking about how the G6 fits into the same size physically as the Galaxy S7 Edge, even though it has a 5.7-inch display. Now, of course, Samsung does interesting things, curving the display on both sides to kind of make it narrower, but they specifically talked about not having problems with accidental touches or your palm touching the side of the display. And that also built into the reliability of the hardware as well.
Yeah, so they're actually doing the exact opposite of what Samsung does with the Edge display. It is very much a flat surface. There is a very subtle curve to the back. And it's actually, you know, it isn't an accident that the front of the phone is very, very flat with this metal trim around it. And again, that plays into the whole reliability angle that they're going with this phone, saying that actually having a flat display and having the corners the way they are helps it withstand a large amount of damage. So if you drop it, it's more than likely to hit one of those four corners. And because of the design and the way the antennas are bonded to the metal, you know, their own testing, I think, shows that, you know, up to 15 drops it'll take before any antenna damage occurs. And of course, water resistance as well is a big deal. And you know, this shape also helps it retain that seal around it.
And it's a very interesting strategy from LG here, because they're not talking about this being a rugged phone or a tough phone like the V10 and V20 have. Of course, it is glass on the back. It's just aluminum around the sides. It doesn't have any extra technology there, but they're more talking about the deep testing that they went through to be able to say, you know, they're never going to say you can drop it this many times without breaking, but they know that accidents happen, and they know that people bring their phones with them everywhere. You know, they are going to get dropped, they are going to come in contact with water, and they're saying, look at all this extra stuff that we've done testing wise from the ground up on the design. It's not just a couple things that they threw in here and there. This is kind of a thread that ran all the way through everything that we saw this week in Korea.
One of the great things about being in Korea, as well as the scenery and the amazing food, is the fact that we got to see some of LG's facilities where they're doing all these tests, where they're actually manufacturing the phone. So first of all, we didn't actually see drop tests. LG showed us its own numbers, but we did see a lot of the tests that LG is doing on the battery, and that's a huge deal, obviously, after the whole Galaxy Note 7 debacle. No one wants to be in a position where you know, you're looking at a phone that is dangerous because of a battery, and one of the sort of underlying things that the battery testing guy was, Steve, I think his name was talking to us about, was that there's very little difference in chemical terms between a bomb and a battery. It's just about how you release that energy. And so some of the tests that we saw the first one, I think, was a massive metal rod being dropped on a battery.
Weighed 9 kilograms.
9 kilograms of metal rod being dropped onto this battery outside of the protection of the chassis, which is a big deal because it's a lithium polymer battery, so it's less kind of resistant to damage anyway than a lithium ion. But it was interesting to watch that. You know, we we went to this testing area behind a load of protective shields. They put the battery in there, dropped the rod on it. Obviously, it was damaged, but despite that damage, it was able to not explode, not spark. And they're very specific about the testing parameters there. If it sparks even slightly, if there's any smoke, that is a failed test. Really interesting to see. You would expect that obviously all bets are off if you expose a phone battery to that kind of force, but LG is saying that's part of its testing parameters.
And the next level of it was even further. So this wasn't external damage. The next test is actually, it's a kind of an industry standard test of fully piercing the battery with a nail, like a sharp nail straight through the middle of the battery with a lot of force as well.
It almost made you wince looking at it. But again, this is to test the separators and the internal structure of the battery to say that, okay, if worst case scenario, something pierces your phone while it's out or while it's being used, is that necessarily going to blow up the battery? And this, again, suspended it from a great height, straight through the phone, and no explosion.
And this is a fully exposed, fully charged battery as well. So this wasn't even stuck inside of the frame, the protective frame of the phone. This is, of course, glass back, metal sides, non-removable battery. So it is stuck in there, which of course provides extra protection. And they even go a step further, though. They do test this if the battery were to come in contact with fire from something else, which I'm not sure the scenario that would involve this.
On top of another smartphone, maybe?
So they even showed that if you catch the battery on fire from an external source, not of its own, you're going to keep that, they have to keep that flame stuck to a small... this cage couldn't have been,
for the fire, basically.
The cage couldn't have been more than 2 feet across, and it still contained itself and failed gracefully, I guess you could say, even up above and beyond what you would ever put a phone through.
It was very interesting at this manufacturing facility to get a look at LG's museum. They have a museum of smartphones and showing the history of the company, starting from Lucky Gold Star back in the day, right through until the present day with smartphones and smart home devices and all this other cool stuff. And that was before our trip to the production line, where we actually saw some LG phones being created.
And this is where it all comes together. Now, here in the middle of February, the G6 is not in production yet, so we were watching V20s roll off the line, and of course, they were still making G5s and things like that and other low-end phones. But the process is the same, and it's extremely time-consuming and intricate.
Yeah, it is, and it is very much a line of processes that it goes through. It's a mix of human labor and robotic stuff. So you have people who actually assemble things and do some of the tests manually. You also have robots that do certain things, because robots are just better at some tasks, like screwing in screws in specific places on the V20 we saw, and running automated tests on certain things. So HDMI, USB, cellular. We saw Verizon V20s, I think, being produced.
Yeah, popping the SIM cards in each one.
Popping the SIM in, running network tests, and pass or fail. If it passes, it goes on to the next stage of the production line. If it fails, it gets bumped back. At the end of all this stuff, it basically gets boxed up in this little box. You have a robot that carries it along the floor to the next stage. Then it gets boxed up, and that's not where the testing ends, because you actually have to weigh each box and find out how many phones are in there. Does the weight match up to what you would expect? And if it does, then it goes on to your carrier store eventually. If not, then it gets bumped back again. So it's this very intricate series of steps that you go through from a pile of components through until a fully boxed up smartphone.
And we didn't even see the earlier levels of production where they're actually building the individual components. We're going to talk about the camera here in a second. Very intricate parts that have to be produced on their own level and go through their own production line. We only saw the final assembly. This is something we know that the design started well before the G5 was even released, and they start designing the individual components there as well.
So kind of interesting you mentioned the G5 there and the start of the design process for the G6. One of the big departures this time is you moving away from modular, and modular phones were supposed to be the big thing in 2016. Didn't work out so well for the G5. And they were straight up, very honest about the fact they had multiple versions of the G6 in prototypes in development.
Some modular, some not?
Some modular, some not. And that started around the beginning of 2016. The one that won out eventually, obviously, was the non-modular one, and easy to see why, given that the G5 wasn't a huge success. But very interesting to hear LG talking about all of the testing that they do, which let them arrive at this ideal size. And also with letting them work out other features like the camera, and the fact that actually a lot of people use the wide-angle camera as the main camera, so you now have that parity in terms of megapixels between the wide-angle camera at 13 and also the main camera at 13.
And they talked a lot about trade-offs. I mean, I think that we've talked about this quite a bit over the last couple of years in these high-end phones, even in, the higher end of the mid-range phones. There's always going to be a trade-off. Even if you go and spend $600 or $700 on a phone, you're not going to be able to get everything. And the G6, when you talk about the cameras, it's a bit of a trade-off here, because compared to the V20, which kind of throws everything at you, and sure, there are still things missing, but the G6, you have a more compact size, you're going to have a lower price, you're going to have a couple things missing, and the cameras are a perfect example where you have the two 13 megapixel sensors. It means that you can have better wide angle shots and consistency between the two, but of course you get a slightly lower resolution, and there's going to be a lack of OIS on the wide camera and things like that. And that's what they we talked to engineers that specifically led the camera division and talked about these things, and sure, they wish that they could put everything in there and maybe the phone would be twice the thickness, maybe you could fit more battery in there or something like that, but that's also going to have a design trade-off.
Sure, and a word that the LG engineers used a lot this time around was balance. And that plays into it as well, because of course you could put any number of camera features in there that you wanted if you didn't care about the camera hub. They wanted to have a device that was very flush, very thin, and very just overall nice and balanced to hold in the hand. And you do that by, sometimes you have to make cuts in terms of, features or certain specs, and that's what they did. They're very upfront about that.
And I think the final level of Samsung shade here was when you talked about the layouts of the dual camera and the fingerprint sensor and the battery, and they showed, of course, leaks of the Galaxy S8, what we assume is the Galaxy S8, and how the fingerprint sensor has to be high and on the right side next to the camera. And LG said, yeah, that's how you fit a bigger battery in there, but they don't think that people can reach up that high with their finger to use the fingerprint sensor. So by moving the fingerprint sensor back where you can actually reach it, there are trade-offs in what the PCB looks like, what the battery looks like.
Of course, LG engineers, as they're making this and as they're watching the same leaks as we are, they're of course, trying to imagine what Samsung is thinking as it's developing the GS8. And they actually showed us a very kind of a comical slide, which we can't show you, but showed the shape of a human hand that would be required to actually
with fingers that are about 30% longer than the palm would indicate.
So kind of funny to see that, and obviously that they want to explain their design decisions relative to their main competitor, which was interesting as well. Some of the people who actually designed the phone actually disassembled one completely for us on camera. So really interesting to see, someone who's very familiar with the internals of this phone actually crack it open very, very precisely and professionally, unscrew all the components, knowing how everything fits together, take out individual parts and show it to us on camera.
Now, this wasn't to try to say that you can do this at home or you can tear it apart.
Do not try this at home.
We're going to be able to show you all kinds of the intricacies of how it comes together. But the thing that stood out to me after the fact that they could pull apart a G6 in about 45 seconds with a handheld screwdriver, but the fact that about half the phone was still stuck together because you have the front glass, the metal frame, the screen is all kind of adhered together. Of course, they use all kinds of adhesives and glues and one-way clips and things like that, and the battery is stuck in there as well. So of course we know these phones, the G6 or otherwise, are not user serviceable, but it was very interesting to me that of course the PCB and the camera come apart, but everything else is really stuck in there solidly together. It's not all modularized.
And it just gives you appreciation of how little space there actually is inside a phone, and when you have to allow space for certain components, certain features, maybe a headphone jack perhaps.
Which there is one.
There is actually, so don't worry about that. But it gives you appreciation that when you need to fit something, even something small, an extra feature inside a phone, that space has to come from somewhere. And the space inside a phone is at a premium these days.
And I think that this kind of brought it full circle for us compared to the design. We saw the disassembly at the very end of our time with LG, and I think that was very strategic and important. Talked about all the things that can fit in there, and then say, now look inside, and you can see exactly, there are fractions of millimeters here and there that just can't be shaved any further. And that's what they point out when they say, look, we have two of the same camera sensors in there. We have a larger 3,300 milliamp hour battery. Yes, it has to be sealed. Sorry, but this is what is required.
It isn't about all the specs in all the things. It's just about having a nice, balanced overall device. And assuming the price is right, I think that could work out quite well for them. oftentimes it's easy to look at software and hardware as very separate things, especially in the Android world. But actually, a lot of the new design features on the G6, okay, you could look at it and say there are a lot of similarities compared to the V20, and there are. But a lot of the new visual things have to do with this 2x1, this 18:9 display, splitting it in two, so you have two squares, top and bottom. A lot of the visual things, for example, in the Contacts app, you have a nice big picture up top. You have your contact information down below, and it is split very evenly between the visual stuff and the actual information. It's not just about extra information density and maybe an extra row of emails or whatever.
The visual designers in the software, in the UX designers to talk about how it works, obviously are in different departments from the hardware, but there really was a synergy going on here that it wasn't. So it didn't feel like the V20, I guess I could say. The V20 has the extra screen on top, and it's kind of separate software, and they say here are the few things that you can do with it. The taller 18:9 display really feels like a cultural shift for LG, that going forward, this is something that they've hit on, and they use this symmetry and the squares and throughout the software. And of course, Android apps are going to scale just fine because they can scale up and move, and there are going to be some settings to get the pain points out of the way, like watching fixed 16:9 content.
Yeah.
But the nice thing is that it doesn't feel like an afterthought. It feels
really
like
doesn't.
a ground-up decision that they've been working on for a long time. I don't get the feeling that there was a 16:9 G6, here.
No, it looks like, I mean, especially on the software side, that was never on the table. You look at all the features like, multiple panes in the same app, so you split the screen down the middle within the same app, showing certain things. The camera was really cool as well, so you have a nice big preview of a 4:3 frame off to the side of pictures that you've recently taken. Yeah, you do get the impression that this was there from the beginning, both on the software and the hardware side. And like I said before, it is easy to think in Android sometimes the software is completely separate from the hardware. Not really the case in the G6, and that's reflected again in the curved nature of the borders around the screen, which echoes a lot of the design decisions that have been made in icons and other places as well. So it does feel like, okay, here's this window into something that the software very much reflects the hardware that you're holding in your hand.
And because you see all this work that went into this is way too much work to put in for a one-off thing.
Sure.
This really, LG representatives said as much. They wouldn't confirm that the next 3 or 4 or 5 phones are going to have this same aspect ratio.
I'll say they probably basically
right, it seems to make sense that after all of this work, and they've really hit on something that I think that functionally makes a whole lot of sense, both in terms of physical size, being able to reach across the display, and also seeing more in the software and how it all works out in terms of symmetry, that this is something that they're going to use going forward. Now, we're not going to probably see an 18:9 tablet. That might not make a whole lot of sense, but you could easily see this applied to a smaller phone even, that you could reach across even easier.
Yeah, and it'll be interesting to see how they develop the V series from here on out, whether that second screen sticks around or whether LG just decides to say, hey, we've got this 18:9 thing, it works pretty well, let's just stick with that and maybe build some of the extra functionality that was in the second screen into just the software in general. That could very well be the case. So it's been an interesting week, I think. A lot of great behind-the-scenes details. We have, of course, our official hands-on video that you can go watch now. We have our disassembly video, so you can watch an LG engineer getting to grips with tearing a G6 down for your viewing pleasure. Be sure to subscribe if you want to see more videos like this from us. And in the meantime, here from Seoul, from a very chilly February morning.
Absolutely freezing.
We'll see you next time.
Bye.